parks and refuges in the state add up, and conservation projects, conservation easements, add up to less than 2.5% of the state of Texas, which still sounds like a lot of land, but it's not a lot of land, and it's also not very well distributed. Almost half of it is in the Trans-Pecos, which is far from the people and far from a lot of the wildlife. As many of y'all may know, most of Texas is grassland or prairie. Texas is a prairie state, and that includes places like the Blackland Prairie, where y'all are, the Coastal Prairie, which starts just south of you, as well as the Panhandle and the large parts of South Texas, and even really the hill country and the rolling plains are grasslands, or at least savannas. And the protected land in the grassland regions is even less percentage than the state as a whole. It's less than 2%. It's really more like 1%. And there are very few large protected areas of prairie. Next. This map shows you all of the conserved land in Texas. And again, that's state parks and wildlife refuges and national parks and conservation easements and all of the above, actually. And as you can see, there's quite a bit of it in some parts of the state, like West Texas, somewhat on the coast. But in your area, you can kind of see there's a big blank. Next. This is the same map by county instead of by acreage. And as you can see, it's even more of a blank. You can see that kind of running from Aggie Land down toward Beeville and Karn City and so forth, there's really very little conservation land of any kind. Next. Now I want to talk about the Fayette Prairie a little bit, and of course, y'all are in it. So I'll tell you for a minute why I think it's so special. There was a guy named Kukler, good German name, and back in the 60s and later in the 80s, he mapped the natural ecoregions of the United States based on the vegetation, the natural vegetation of each one. He came up with 123 different regions of the country, of which there's about, well, quite a few in Texas. And you're in a unique one, the Fayette Prairie, which he called Andropogon bucklowy, meaning that he thought, I guess, the native grass, the dominant native grasses were blue stem and buffalo grass, which is sort of arguable. But anyway, that's what he called the Fayette Prairie. And he called it a distinct region of the state. And it's one of only 2 regions of the state, and only maybe a dozen or so in the entire country, with no conservation in it in the sense of permanently protected land. And so that's a challenge, I feel. Fayette Prairie also is a very scenic part of the state, in my opinion, particularly the rolling hills aspect of it, which, you know, you've got several geologic formations that run under the region, and the Oakville and Fleming, some of the others, and they form you know, very, very nice landscape, which particularly around places like Round Top and Brenham and LaGrange and Schulenburg and Hallettsville was has been very sought after, and as a result, largely cultivated. There's also, you know, a lot of cultural and historic heritage there too, and in the region. There are, I think I saw something in the chat, very small areas in northern Fayette County. Yeah, the areas of conservation areas which exist in the Fayette Prairie are very small, and they include the Monument Hill State Park, the Washington on the Brazos State Park, and about 4 or 5 conservation easements or other private land conservation. And a couple of those are in Fayette County. One is in Washington County. They're all pretty small, and they don't have very much prairie in particular. That, like Monument Hill, for example, does have native prairie, but I think it's 10 acres or 5 or 10 acres or less. So most of the conservation areas that we do have in the area are working lands without prairie remnants, or at least without very good prairie remnants. And there are still quite a few native prairie remnants, as you all know, in the area. And in Colorado County, Fayette County, Austin County, Washington County, Lavaca County, most of the counties in the region do have some good remnants, but they're declining, and have even in the last 15 or 20 years, I've seen quite a few wink out and disappear, just because of development or because of perhaps over-intensive management, and they've become encroached by King Ranch bluestem or Clayburgh bluestem, which are exotic grasses. Next. So talking a little bit about conservation options, and I stress this because, like I said, we've got so many remnants in the Fayette Prairie that are disappearing right before our eyes, at least in terms of being high fidelity prairies. They may still be working lands, but they've lost most of their diversity. And so to really deal with that, we want to try to protect, I think, a few examples of the Fayette Prairie, whether it's private land ownership or public. And basically the options there's 4 options, and these are them. The first and easiest is donation of a conservation easement by a private landowner. And this remnant, picture of the remnant, by the way, that is a Fayette County remnant. Donated conservation easements, in some cases purchased conservation easements, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Then public land acquisition, and again, there's really not been any in y'all's area much, except for the 2 small state parks I mentioned. And of course, you've got the Atwater Prairie Chicken Refuge, but it's really more, I would call it more coastal prairie. I guess that's sort of debatable. And then private land acquisition, which means land acquisition by a nonprofit like the Nature Conservancy, which I work for, or INPAT. So next. And I have a slide for each one of those options, or at least 3 of the options. I don't know if I have one for public land. So donated conservation easements, and the property that you see in this picture is a donated conservation easement. It's in North Texas, but it's a really nice native prairie, which I worked with the landowner to get this easement done year before last. And it was a really great story, just really nice family. And the gentleman called me, and he was just called me out of the blue. He was a donor to TNC, so he'd given us some money, I think, and got our magazine and so forth, and knew what we did. And he had decided he wanted to put a conservation easement on his place. And he said he had some really nice woods, and it's a pretty big place. So I said, well, I'll come up and take a look at it. So I drove up there and I looked at it, and I was expecting to see some woods. I drove in his gate and drove down his driveway. It had a long driveway. And I was sort of looking for his house because it wasn't really obvious immediately where his house was. So I was kind of wandering around his property. And, after about 5 minutes, I realized that I'd been wandering through a really high quality native prairie. And, I actually stopped and pulled off, and I called my friend Jason Singhurst with Parks and Wildlife, who some of y'all probably know. And I said, Jason, I think I'm either lost or I don't know what is going on. But anyway, I'm surrounded by a giant native Sylvius dropseed prairie. And so I texted him a picture with my phone, and he was like, dude, that's a prairie. So anyway, We ended up doing the conservation easement on the woods as well as on the prairie, and really, really great project. So a conservation easement is, as a lot of y'all know, I'm sure, is a agreement between a private landowner and a nonprofit like ours, or like INPAT. And INPAT holds conservation easements. Nature Conservancy holds conservation easements. The landowner that donates a conservation easement can usually get a tax deduction for doing so. And the conservation easement usually is designed to allow the landowner to keep doing what they're doing on the property, and restricts future uses that are inconsistent with that. It restricts development, it restricts subdivision, doesn't necessarily prohibit those things, but it restricts them, and it usually limits them to a part of the property. In the case of this easement, which I'm talking about, which is owned by a family named Temple, they agreed that they can build home sites on their pond and in the woods, but not on the prairie, because I said, the prairie is the most sensitive resource. And so they said, okay. So conservation easements can lower your property taxes somewhat. They don't always. If you've already got ag, it's probably not going to be real significant. And they usually do not help with condemnation or eminent domain, but they can in certain cases. And examples in the region, like I mentioned, there are 2 or 3 conservation easements in your area. One of them is the Pecor Farm, which is in, I guess it's in Austin County. Actually, I can't remember where it is, where the county, it's where the counties come together. But anyway, they donated a conservation easement on their place and a few years ago, and it's held by another land trust, nonprofit organization, and they do have a couple of remnants. So that would be, I guess, the only remnants in the area that are under easement as far as I know. So I guess ready for the next slide. Purchased conservation easements are similar to, the easement is similar. The main difference is that instead of taking a tax deduction for the value of the easement, the landowner gets paid for at least part of it. And sometimes we'll work out something where we'll pay them part of the value of the easement, and they'll donate the rest and take a deduction. So that's called a bargain sale, and that is a good way to do it, because here in Texas we have no money for conservation, so it's very limited. So there are programs that purchase conservation easements. The NRCS has one, which is called the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program. Parks and Wildlife has one that's called the Texas Farm and Ranch Conservation Program. And they are not well funded, like I said, but they can in some cases pay for part of the value of the easement, and you can mix and match them too, but they're very competitive because there's, again, not much money. Those easements usually allow grazing, but they don't have to. They usually, obviously, do not allow a lot of development, maybe a little, and the purpose really is to keep land rural or wildlife habitat, or working land, farms, ranches, and in particular native grasslands. And NRCS actually targets native grasslands. So this program, if you know of a landowner who is potentially interested in selling a conservation easement, that program might be to their advantage, because they can work with NRCS, and NRCS will pay for most of the value of the easement because they are particularly keying on native grassland. Usually NRCS will only fund half of the easement value, but in your case, if it's native grassland, it would be more. It would be 75%. And so that is a lot more interesting to the landowner, obviously, than 50%. Next slide. Private land acquisition It doesn't happen very often, but once in a while it will. The Nature Conservancy owns land all over Texas, and we do own some prairies. Some of those we bought, some of those were given to us by private individuals generously to conserve them. INPAT also owns and manages, and I can't tell you exactly how many prairies or how much acreage right now, but it's about 5,000 acres statewide, and it's all, mostly prairie. And that's been very rewarding for me in the last few years, working with INPAT and acquiring some of those native prairies. And they may, in some cases, be small, but they're just rare as jewels. And this picture that you see is the west property, which was acquired from a neighbor and added to our Climber Meadow Preserve. So it's both a Nature Conservancy and an INPAT project. It's up in North Texas, but the Climber Meadow Preserve is our big prairie that we own. And this was a property that was on our neighboring fence line and that we had wanted to acquire for a long time. And the neighbor was real nice and would often call us and have us come over and advise her about her cows and bring her groceries and so on. But she had never really wanted to sell the prairie, or if she did, we didn't have money to buy it. And finally, we had some money from a mitigation settlement, and she called us and said she was ready. And so, we were able to appraise the property, and the appraisal was good enough for her, and she was ready to sell it. And so she sold it to us, and we love her, and she likes the Nature Conservancy, and INPAT also is involved because they hold a conservation easement on it. So it's kind of a double protection for it. And we own it now, and we're burning it, and we'll probably eventually knock down the fences so that it'll just be part of our preserve. And I was also involved in buying a native prairie in the last year, which was a TNC and INPAT project. And this time it worked backwards. Native Prairie Association of Texas owns it, and the Nature Conservancy holds an easement on it. And this was another property that we acquired with a mitigation settlement. And that's called the Talbot property, and some of y'all have heard of it probably. It's one of our more recent projects, but it was purchased from two brothers who are getting up in years, and they have managed the property their whole lives, and for many years. And actually, David Talbot remembers cutting hay on that property when he was a boy, and he's now in his 70s. And so it was very special property to them, and they would not have parted with it for under any other terms, but they wanted it to be conserved. They knew that we would conserve it, and they knew what it was. They knew that they had one of the very, very few examples of native prairie ground. So that was a really great project. We do not have any preserves in the Fayette Prairie ecoregion per se, and I would really like to, and I think INPAT would like to as well. We do have a potential project that we're working on that may come to be, but I can't tell you yet because it's not really, it's always bad to talk about something before it happens. It's just bad luck. So anyway, next slide. So I've talked about acquisition and protection so far. I don't want to completely neglect the topic of restoration, although there's others that can speak to it more than I can because what I do is largely real estate transactions. So, there are not a lot of public lands in the Fayette Prairie ecoregion. There are a few, and I feel like that's an opportunity for restoration, potentially in the Fayette Prairie. I'd love to see some prairie restored on state park land, for example. There's also, of course, private landowners. Many of you on this call are private landowners, I'm sure, and your focus is prairie restoration on your own properties, and you're probably familiar with some of the resources that are out there that can help with that, like EQIP and GRIP. You've got the Jim Willis's group, the Wildlife Habitat Federation, also will provide equipment and seed, and in some cases do the work of restoration. And that's kind of their activity, and they are working in, I think, about 25 or 30 counties doing that, including most of the Fayette Prairie counties. And the only thing I would stress on that is just the importance of using local seed, because a lot of prairie restorations use cultivars because you kind of have to. If you're doing big acreage, you just can't do it any other way. But those things don't necessarily persist or do as well. And also, I don't personally feel that the value of that, there is a lot of value in that for wildlife, but when we're trying to save the last remnants of the Fayette Prairie, I think we really want to try to save the local ecotypes, the genotypes, the genetic stock that is out there in the prairie, and particularly the forbs. And there are also, of course, relatively few species of grasses that are really important, but there are myriad species of forbs and that you can have in a native prairie. And those are the things we're going to lose if we lose prairie remnants. And so I think it's very important to try to save prairie remnants in the Fayette Prairie region. And I think it's something that we all need to look for ways to do, and we need to look for ways to get more funding to do. And I think that's the last slide. But if y'all have any questions, let me know.